For centuries, people assumed King Henry VIII rested in an undisturbed royal tomb. They were wrong. When the chamber beneath the chapel was finally revealed, it exposed a scene that stunned everyone who saw it. The condition of the vault was nothing like what history had promised, and what lay inside defied every expectation.
Here is Henry VIII's tomb, and they know that in there are the bodies of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. That is an interesting topic on its own because there is a lost tomb of Henry VIII.
The king who would not decay. Henry VIII spent the last years of his life in a state that shocked everyone around him. Reports from the Tudor court, the royal household that lived and worked around the king, describe a ruler who could barely move without help. His once athletic body had grown so large that specially built lifting devices were needed simply to raise him from his bed. His legs were covered in deep ulcers that refused to heal, and according to eyewitness accounts, the smell from the infected wounds filled entire rooms before he even entered. Some physicians later suggested that he may have suffered from a metabolic condition that affected his weight and circulation, although this remains speculation. What is certain is that his body was failing rapidly, and the king, who once rode confidently into tournaments, now lived with constant pain and exhaustion. Several courtiers even wrote that he looked close to death long before he took his final breath. When Henry died in January 1547, the embalmers who prepared royal bodies faced a situation far beyond what their varied methods could handle. Tudor embalming practices were not fully standardized. Most preparations relied on spices, oils, alcohol, and layers of linen wrappings to slow decay. These measures could delay natural decomposition in a normal body, but they offered little control over a corpse that had already begun to break down before death. Henry's size created an even greater challenge. His body required a much larger coffin lined with thick sheets of lead. Lead coffins were meant to contain smell and fluids, but they also trapped gases. As the body decomposed, those gases built pressure inside the sealed container and turned the coffin into something that could easily crack or burst. The trouble began during Henry's funeral procession. The body was moved from Whitehall, the royal palace in London, to Windsor Castle, the monarch's burial site. On the way, the procession stopped at Sion Abbey, a religious house near London. According to several accounts, something disturbing happened there. It was reported that dark fluid seeped from the coffin and pooled onto the floor. Some later chroniclers even claimed that dogs entered the hall and licked at the liquid before attendants chased them away. Others insisted the incident was a divine warning meant to reflect God's disapproval of the king's actions during his life. Whether exaggerated or not, these reports show how uneasy people felt about the state of the king's body. Henry was placed in a temporary vault inside St. George's Chapel. This was meant to be a short-term arrangement because during his life, he had expected to be moved later into the enormous tomb he had been planning for years. Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his only legitimate son, was already in the same vault because Henry had chosen her as his eternal companion. But even before the vault was sealed, there were quiet concerns. Some attendants felt the burial had been rushed and that something about the coffin seemed wrong. A few believed the king's body was already reacting to the pressure forming inside the lead casing. These worries were soon dismissed and eventually forgotten once the stone was set in place. But the uneasy burial left behind questions that would not return until many generations later. While Henry's body decomposed in ways Tudor embalmers could barely understand, an even stranger story was already forming above ground. It was tied to a tomb he spent decades designing, but never lived to see completed. The lost megatomb. Henry VIII did not just want a tomb. He wanted a monument that would crush every other royal burial in England. His father already lay in a beautiful chapel at Westminster, but that was not enough for Henry. According to historians, he wanted something bigger, darker, and more impressive. A tomb that would remind future kings that no one had ever matched his power. Cardinal Wolsey had once been the most powerful church official in England and one of Henry's closest advisors. But when he lost the king's support, his property was taken by the crown. Among the items seized was his unfinished tomb. Henry claimed it for himself and treated it like raw material. Wolsey had planned an impressive monument for his own burial, but when Henry looked at it, he decided it was far too small for a king. He ordered a new design that was larger, heavier, and far more crowded with religious figures. The tomb would be wrapped in black marble, filled with gilded angels, prophets, apostles, and full-size images of Henry and Jane Seymour lying in state. Work began on a scale that shocked even those used to royal spending. Italian artists were invited to England. Skilled sculptors and metalworkers were hired. Drawings were changed and improved again and again as Henry asked for more details, more figures, and more symbols of victory. A full-size image of Henry was cast while he was still alive, so that his face in death would look like a ruler who never weakened. Workshops around Westminster stored carved pillars, heavy candlesticks, and long relief panels showing religious scenes and royal power. The monument existed in pieces, waiting for the day they would all be assembled into something that would fill its own chapel. That day never came. War cost money, and Henry's campaigns against France and Scotland drained the treasury. According to some records, payments to the craftsmen slowed, then stopped. The Italian sculptor returned home. Assistants were released. The unfinished monument sat in storage while attention turned to ships, soldiers, and fortifications. When Henry finally died, the instructions in his will still described the tomb as something that was close to completion. He had written those instructions earlier, when he still believed the work was progressing. In reality, by the time of his death, no one was building the monument at all. His children inherited the throne, but not his obsession with the tomb. Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth had their own problems. None of them spent their money or time completing a monument that only served their father's pride. Over time, the pieces were sold, reused, or melted. Part of the structure ended up being used for the tomb of another national hero. Other parts disappeared into churches on the continent. What was supposed to be the greatest royal tomb in English history quietly broke apart, while Henry lay in a simple vault that was never meant to hold him forever. But as Henry's dream tomb disappeared piece by piece, the vault that held him began its own quiet transformation, becoming a mystery England would eventually forget. The Vanishing Vault. When Henry VIII was first placed in the vault beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel, everyone involved knew exactly where the chamber lay. Clergy stood around the opening. Royal officials watched the stone close over the king. Craftsmen who had built the vault could have pointed to it without hesitation. Yet the burial was never meant to be permanent, and that single detail set the stage for what happened next. Because the chamber was considered temporary, no one carved a marker, no stone inscription was added, and no detailed floor plan was preserved for future generations. The vault was sealed quietly, with the understanding that Henry would one day be moved to the enormous tomb he had designed for himself. That day never came, and the location slowly slipped into uncertainty. As decades passed, the chapel changed again and again. Kings and queens used it for ceremonies, new choir stalls were installed, old stones were lifted and relayed. Repairs were carried out during political upheaval, especially when religious institutions were reorganized and many documents were lost or removed. According to some historical accounts, even the clergy who served there began giving vague explanations when visitors asked where Henry was buried. They said he rested beneath the choir, but none could identify the exact stone. Life inside the chapel continued without pause. Worshippers prayed, choir boys practiced. Tourists and officials walked the floor without realizing they were stepping directly above the remains of the king who tore England away from Rome and reshaped its future. Nothing distinguished Henry's burial from the rest of the stones around it. The vault had become invisible in plain sight. Superstitions made the situation worse. Some people believed that disturbing any royal grave could bring misfortune. Others whispered that the ground beneath the choir felt unsettled and should not be touched. These fears stopped anyone from searching for the exact vault. Many assumed that Henry's magnificent tomb must have been completed somewhere else. The idea that he still lay in a small, unmarked chamber seemed unthinkable. With time, the memory faded entirely. The vault disappeared from practical knowledge, sealed beneath layers of stone, history, and silence. It remained hidden for generations until a sudden political crisis forced officials to uncover the forgotten chamber again. That crisis arrived with the downfall of a king whose violent end would collide with Henry's legacy in a way no one expected. The second king in the dark. When Charles I was executed, England entered a period of severe tension. Parliament feared that his burial could become a place of gathering for loyalists who wished to honor him. They insisted on a burial that would draw no attention. There would be no public mourning and no ceremony. His body needed to be hidden quickly in a place that was secure, controlled, and unlikely to attract crowds. Windsor Castle was the ideal choice. It was heavily guarded, far from the unrest in London, and firmly under parliamentary authority. According to some accounts, officials searched for a location within the castle grounds that was both respectable for a king and safely out of sight. During this hurried search, someone remembered an old reference to a vault under the choir of St. George's Chapel. It was described vaguely, almost carelessly, yet it seemed ideal. When workers pried up the stones and peered inside, they realized they had rediscovered Henry VIII's long-lost burial chamber. The vault had not been opened for generations. It held Henry VIII and Jane Seymour untouched in the darkness. There was no time for second thoughts. Charles's coffin was brought in at once. The work that followed was harsh and tense. It was winter and the chapel was cold. Light was poor and the men were required to finish quickly to avoid attention. They were not permitted the slow, careful handling usually given to royal burials. Charles's lead coffin was extremely heavy, and the vault was far too small to allow easy movement. The workers had to lift, turn, and force the coffin into its place. In doing this, they shifted the other coffins in the cramped chamber. Some examinations made many years later indicate that the wooden supports beneath Henry VIII's coffin were likely strained or broken during this rushed placement. Later observers believed that Henry's massive lead coffin, already under pressure from internal gases, may have cracked or become unstable at this moment. Charles I was placed only inches from Henry VIII, a pairing that carried an unsettling irony. One king had expanded royal power to an extreme level. The other had tried to defend that same authority and had lost his life because of it. Several historians believe that placing the two side by side unintentionally reflected England's long struggle with absolute monarchy. Others argue that it was nothing more than a practical decision made during a dangerous and chaotic period, with no deeper meaning intended. Either way, the closeness of their coffins became part of the vault's troubled history. Once Charles was inside, the vault was sealed again. It now held two monarchs. The disturbances caused during the hurried burial left hidden damage that would remain unnoticed until the vault was opened again many years later. Only then would the consequences of that rushed night become impossible to ignore. But the turmoil caused by Charles's secret burial was only the beginning. The vault would be exposed again, and what the next observers found inside would shock everyone who saw it. The day workers broke through the chapel floor. The rediscovery of Henry VIII's vault did not begin with archaeologists or royal historians. It began with ordinary workers who were carrying out routine repairs inside the chapel. According to reports, they were lifting and resetting old stones near the choir when one slab shifted in a strange way. Before anyone could react, it dropped inward. A hole opened beneath their feet, revealing a silent darkness that had not been exposed in generations. The workers froze. Some stepped back in fear. Others leaned forward, trying to understand what they were seeing. A sudden rush of cold and stale air escaped from below, and one worker later said it felt as if the vault had exhaled after centuries without being touched. Lanterns were lowered into the opening, and the light revealed a cramped burial chamber containing 3 large lead coffins. The workers called for officials immediately. When the first royal attendants arrived and looked inside, they identified Jane Seymour's coffin on one side. It appeared untouched and well sealed. Charles I's coffin rested near her. It showed age but remained solid and intact. The third coffin, Henry VIII's, was positioned in the center of the vault. When the lantern light shifted toward Henry's coffin, the mood inside the chapel changed. His coffin looked nothing like the others. It lay at a severe angle, almost as if it had fallen. The wooden supports that were supposed to hold it steady had completely collapsed. The lead casing had split along several seams. Long cracks ran across its surface. Some sections looked bent from pressure inside the coffin. Unverified reports from that day claim that several observers stepped back when they saw the damage, either out of shock or out of fear that the weakened vault could shift further. Royal officials were summoned within hours. Physicians arrived with them because no one knew what condition Henry's remains might be in. The chapel, usually filled with quiet movement and soft echoes, became painfully still. Everyone who approached the edge of the opening described the same unsettling impression. The vault felt tense, almost fragile, as if any disturbance might cause the coffins to shift again. Once the scene had been examined, officials decided the vault should be sealed. They recorded the condition of the coffins, but refused to open Henry's any further. They argued that the structure was unstable and that opening the coffin could cause the entire chamber to collapse. Their decision was made quickly, and the stone covering was replaced, leaving the vault in darkness once more. Yet even these observers did not uncover the full truth. 75 years later, during a sanctioned investigation carried out under controlled conditions, something far more disturbing would finally be revealed inside Henry VIII's shattered tomb. The unbelievable truth. When officials finally approved a formal survey of the vault, only a few trusted individuals were allowed to take part. According to accounts from the time, a surveyor was sent down to measure the chamber and record exactly what he saw. He descended with a lamp, a measuring line, and a small toolkit. Everyone else waited above the opening in complete silence. The entire chapel felt tense, as if the room were holding its breath. The surveyor first examined the right side of the vault. Jane Seymour's coffin rested there. It was sealed and perfectly straight. She had been buried with careful preparation, and the lead casing showed no signs of strain. Beside her, Charles I's coffin appeared aged but stable. It had survived its rough handling during his secret burial, and the metal surface remained solid. Nothing about these two coffins suggested any disturbance. Then the surveyor turned his lamp toward the center of the vault, and the entire mood changed. Henry VIII's coffin was a wreck. The huge lead casing had buckled, torn, and collapsed in several places. The wooden supports beneath it had failed completely, leaving the coffin tilted against the vault wall. Long cracks ran across the surface, and parts of the metal looked warped, as though something inside had pushed outward with great force. The surveyor leaned closer and saw exposed bone near one of the torn edges. It was thick and heavy and still attached to scraps of cloth and flakes of lead. Many historians later suggested that this bone was likely part of Henry's leg, forced outward by the same internal pressure that had destroyed the coffin. As the surveyor studied the floor around the collapsed supports, he noticed smaller objects mixed with fragments of wood and splintered lead. What he first thought was rubble contained pale, jointed pieces. The notes describe short bones, likely from the fingers, and what seemed to be part of a hand. The idea that pieces of Henry's body had been pushed out of the coffin and scattered on the vault floor horrified everyone who later read the report. Then the surveyor observed something even worse. In a narrow gap between the coffins, in a place that did not match the position of any recorded burial, he saw another cluster of bones, They were not connected to Henry's exposed remains. They were not near Jane Seymour. They were not close enough to Charles I to have come from his coffin. There was no casket, no plaque, and no entry in the chapel records. They were simply there, loose, silent, and belonging to an unknown person. This discovery created confusion that has never been resolved, and then came the detail that stunned the officials who reviewed the report. Near one of the cracks in Henry's coffin, the surveyor found a patch of dark, dried residue on the stone floor. He described it as a thick stain that had hardened over time. According to several historians, the color and placement resembled the same dark fluid reported at Sion Abbey during Henry's funeral procession. Some experts believe this residue may have seeped out long before the vault was sealed for the final time. Others argue that the pressure inside the coffin could have forced it out gradually over many years. The match between the two locations unsettled everyone who studied the notes. After this discovery, the vault was no longer viewed as a damaged royal chamber. It became a forensic puzzle and a disturbing scene of mixed remains. Some historians argue that the extra bones were moved during earlier building work and hidden in the vault without record. Others believe rough handling during Charles I's burial dragged bones from a nearby area. A few researchers raise a darker theory, although there is no proof. They suspect that someone may have been placed there secretly during a time of political fear, believing the vault would stay sealed forever. Theories vary, but the record remains the same. Henry VIII does not lie whole in a grand tomb. He rests in a shattered coffin with a leg bone pushed through torn lead, finger bones on the vault floor, an unexplained set of remains beside him, and the same dark stain that first appeared during his funeral journey. For a king who tried to control everything, his resting place became a scene he never could have imagined. Aftermath of the discovery. The discoveries inside the vault forced historians and medical researchers to re-examine Henry VIII's final years with new evidence. The exposed leg bone, described as unusually thick, supported long-standing theories that Henry suffered from severe swelling and chronic infection late in life. Some medical specialists noted that its density matched descriptions of the pain that left him barely able to walk. The vault had unintentionally preserved physical proof that aligned with written accounts from the Tudor period. Fragments of fabric still attached to the bone added another surprising detail. They suggested that parts of Henry's burial garments survived longer than expected in the damp vault. Some researchers believe the collapse of the coffin pressed the cloth tightly against the bone, slowing its decay. Others proposed that the oils and spices used during embalming altered how the materials broke down. These fragments offered rare insight into Tudor burial methods that are usually lost to time. The unidentified bones created the most serious debate. They did not match Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, or Charles I. Some experts proposed that the bones belonged to a cleric originally buried beneath the chapel floor, whose remains were accidentally disturbed during earlier renovations. Others argued that during periods of political unrest, displaced remains may have been placed in the vault temporarily. A smaller group of researchers suggested a darker theory. They believed that someone may have been buried secretly inside the chamber during a period of crisis because the vault was sealed, hidden, and unlikely to ever be opened. Without reopening the vault, none of these theories can be confirmed. So here is the question: should the vault be opened again to uncover the truth, or should its remaining secrets stay sealed forever?